The morning of June 12, 1925, broke cool and overcast across the industrial heartland of Michigan. Lieutenant Commander Isoroku Yamamoto, naval attaché to the Japanese embassy in Washington, stood at the edge of Ford Motor Company's Rouge complex in Dearborn, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Not from fear for himself, but from fear for his nation. The plant stretched before him like a mechanical city, 1.5 miles wide, more than a mile long. Smokestacks pierced the grey sky. The roar of machinery created a sound like continuous thunder. Railroad cars moved along 100 miles of internal track, carrying iron ore from the docks where Great Lakes freighters unloaded their cargo. This was not simply a factory. This was a statement of industrial philosophy that contradicted everything Yamamoto's superiors in Tokyo believed about how war would be won. He had been touring America for the past year. He had driven from coast to coast. He had seen the oil fields of Texas, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the agricultural vastness of the Midwest. But nothing had prepared him for this. Henry Ford had built something unprecedented in human history. A manufacturing complex that transformed raw materials into finished automobiles with a completeness and speed that seemed to violate the very laws of industrial organization. Inside the complex, Yamamoto watched as river barges delivered iron ore, coal, and limestone directly to blast furnaces. The ore went in one end, steel came out the other. That steel moved directly to rolling mills where it was pressed into sheets. Those sheets traveled to stamping plants where massive presses, each weighing hundreds of tons, crashed down with pneumatic force, transforming flat metal into car bodies in seconds. Glass plants produced windshields, tire factories produced rubber, power plants generated electricity, all of it connected, all of it flowing, all of it controlled by men who understood something fundamental about modern production. The Japanese officer carried a small notebook. He wrote constantly, filling pages with observations, sketches, calculations. His American hosts were generous with information. They showed him everything. They explained the assembly line concept with pride. They demonstrated how Ford had achieved what he called vertical integration, controlling every step from iron ore to finished product. They did not realize they were showing a future enemy the source of their invincibility. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yamamoto was not an ordinary naval officer. At 41 years old, he stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, with a commanding presence that made men forget his height. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, blown off during the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when a shell exploded near his battle station. That wound had taught him something about industrial warfare. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed halfway around the world only to be destroyed by Japanese naval gunfire in a single afternoon. Superior preparation, superior tactics, and superior will had won that day. But what Yamamoto was seeing in Michigan in 1925 suggested that future wars would not be decided by such things. He had arrived in America in 1919 to study at Harvard University. His official assignment was language training. His actual mission, understood by both the Japanese Navy and his instructors, was intelligence gathering. He needed to understand American capability and American character. What kind of nation was this? What were its strengths? What were its weaknesses? Could Japan, if war came, prevail against such an opponent? The answers he was discovering terrified him. At Harvard, Yamamoto had studied economics and industrial organization. He read American history. He practiced English until he spoke the language fluently. But more importantly, he traveled. During breaks and vacations, he hitchhiked across the country. He stayed in small towns. He talked to farmers, mechanics, oil workers, and factory laborers. He wanted to understand not just American government and military, but American society. And everywhere he went, he saw the same thing. A nation that had industrialized not just its factories, but its thinking. Americans approached every problem as if it were a manufacturing challenge. How do you make something faster? How do you make it cheaper? How do you make more of it? This mindset pervaded everything. It was in the hardware stores where ordinary citizens could purchase tools that in Japan would be restricted to specialized craftsmen. It was in the automobile dealerships where farmers bought vehicles with more mechanical sophistication than most Japanese military equipment. It was in the way Americans talked about problems, always looking for systems, for processes, for ways to scale solutions. The Ford River Rouge complex was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Yamamoto watched as automobiles rolled off the assembly line, one complete vehicle every minute. He did the mathematics in his notebook. 60 cars per hour, 1,500 cars per day, more than 500,000 cars per year from this single facility. And Ford had other plants. General Motors had plants. Chrysler had plants. America was producing millions of automobiles annually. His mind shifted to military applications. If these factories could produce automobiles at such rates, what could they produce if they converted to military production, trucks, tanks, aircraft engines? And, more importantly, if American industry could achieve such coordination, such integration, such efficiency in peacetime commerce, what could it achieve when motivated by the total mobilization of war? Yamamoto had studied the American Civil War. He knew that in the 1860s, the industrial North had ground down the agricultural South through sheer material superiority. The Confederacy had produced brilliant generals, demonstrated superior tactical skill in many battles, and fought with desperate courage. None of it had mattered. The Union had simply produced more rifles, more cannons, more railroad track, more uniforms, more food. The South had eventually been buried under an avalanche of northern industrial output. He feared Japan was positioning itself to replay that tragedy on a global scale. The differences in industrial capacity were staggering. American steel production in 1925 exceeded 60 million tons annually. Japan, in a good year, produced perhaps 2 million tons. The United States produced more than half of the world's total steel output. Japanese production represented a small fraction of global supply, and steel was the foundation of everything. Steel meant ships, tanks, artillery, vehicles, aircraft frames, machine tools, railroad track. Steel meant the ability to sustain modern warfare. But the disparity went deeper than simple production numbers. It was about systems, about philosophy, about how nations approached the challenge of coordinating complex industrial activity. Yamamoto watched Ford's internal railroad system. 100-car trains moved constantly through the complex, carrying raw materials to processing plants and finished components to assembly areas. The scheduling alone represented an organizational achievement. Every train had to arrive at precisely the right moment. Too early and materials would pile up, blocking production. Too late and assembly lines would stop, wasting labor and machine time. Americans had solved this problem. They had created logistics systems, management hierarchies, communication networks that allowed them to coordinate industrial activity on a scale that seemed almost impossible. And they had done it in pursuit of profit, in the competitive environment of capitalism, without government direction or central planning. The efficiency was not imposed from above. It emerged from below, from the genius of individual engineers and managers competing to solve problems better than their rivals. Japan, by contrast, operated on completely different principles. Japanese industry remained fragmented, dominated by family zaibatsu conglomerates that cooperated when required by the government, but fundamentally competed for market share and influence. Quality was achieved through craftsmanship, through skilled workers applying traditional methods. Production increases came from working longer hours, from dedication and discipline, not from fundamental reorganization of production methods. Yamamoto had seen Japanese factories. He knew their capabilities and their limitations. A Japanese aircraft manufacturer might produce beautiful planes, each one individually crafted to high standards by skilled workers. But producing one beautiful aircraft per week meant nothing if your enemy could produce 5 adequate aircraft per day. The arithmetic of industrial warfare was brutal and unforgiving. Quantity had a quality all its own. At the Rouge complex, he watched workers on the assembly line. They were not craftsmen in the traditional sense. Many performed simple, repetitive tasks, A single worker might spend his entire shift installing the same component, the same way, on car after car. This seemed wasteful of human potential, even degrading. But the productivity was undeniable. Ford had discovered that by breaking complex assembly into simple steps, he could use relatively unskilled labor to achieve results that would otherwise require years of training. More importantly, this system was scalable. If Ford needed to double production, he did not need to wait years to train new craftsmen. He could hire workers off the street, give them a few days of instruction, and have them contributing to production almost immediately. The skills were not in the individual workers, but in the system itself, in the way the assembly line was designed, in the fixtures and tools that guided each step. Japan could not replicate this. Japanese culture valued mastery, craftsmanship, the dedication of years to perfecting a skill. This produced excellence in many areas, but it created a fundamental bottleneck. You could not rapidly scale production when every worker required years of training. You could not replace skilled workers lost to combat when it took a decade to train their replacements. Yamamoto understood this represented a strategic vulnerability that his superiors refused to acknowledge. He had tried to explain his concerns in reports back to Tokyo. He had written that anyone who had seen the automobile factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knew that Japan lacked the national power for a naval race with America. His reports were received politely. They were filed. Nothing changed. The Japanese Naval Ministry continued to plan for war with America based on the assumption that superior fighting spirit, better tactics, and technological advantages in specific weapon systems would compensate for any industrial disparities. It was a comforting delusion. It was also suicidal. The tour continued. Ford representatives explained their blast furnace operations. The Rouge complex consumed thousands of tons of coal daily, brought in by lake freighter. The coal was converted to coke in massive ovens that glowed red-hot day and night. The coke was fed to blast furnaces, along with iron ore and limestone. Superheated air was blown through the mixture. The iron ore melted. Impurities were drawn off as slag. Molten iron flowed out at nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, glowing yellow-white, too bright to look at directly. This molten iron was converted to steel in open hearth furnaces. Carbon content was adjusted. Alloy elements were added. The steel was poured into molds to create ingots weighing several tons each. These ingots were reheated and passed through rolling mills where massive hydraulic presses compressed them into sheets of specific thicknesses. All of this happened with continuous flow. Raw materials entered at one end. Steel products emerged at the other. The entire process, from iron ore to finished steel, occurred within the boundaries of the Rouge complex. Yamamoto asked about production capacity. The Ford representatives answered without hesitation. The Rouge could produce enough steel to build hundreds of thousands of vehicles per year. If necessary, those vehicles could be military trucks rather than civilian automobiles. The conversion would be simple. The machinery, the workforce, the supply chains, all of it could pivot from peace to war with minimal disruption. This was the nightmare scenario. American industry was not like a sword that had to be forged before battle. It was like a flood behind a dam. The productive capacity already existed. It was currently producing automobiles and consumer goods. But if war came, if the political will emerged, that capacity could be redirected to military production with terrifying speed. And the scale was overwhelming. The Rouge employed more than 75,000 workers. Ford Motor Company as a whole employed hundreds of thousands. General Motors, Chrysler, and dozens of smaller manufacturers employed hundreds of thousands more. The entire American automotive industry represented millions of workers with mechanical skills, millions of machine tools, thousands of factories, integrated supply chains stretching across the continent. Yamamoto did more calculations in his notebook. If the American automotive industry converted to military production, it could potentially produce tens of thousands of trucks per year, thousands of tanks per year. The numbers seemed absurd, but the productive capacity was demonstrable. It was not theoretical. It was running in front of him. turning iron ore into automobiles at a rate that exceeded the total industrial output of many nations. Japan had nothing comparable. Japanese industry was concentrated in a few major cities, production capacity was limited. Steel output was constrained by access to raw materials. Japan had virtually no domestic iron ore of sufficient quality. It had no oil. It had limited coal. Every expansion of Japanese industrial capacity required imported raw materials, transported across vulnerable sea lanes, processed in factories that were already operating near maximum capacity, and those factories were qualitatively different. Japanese industrial plants emphasized quality over quantity. This made sense in peacetime, when you were trying to compete on global markets with established Western manufacturers. Superior craftsmanship justified higher prices. But in wartime, when you needed to replace combat losses quickly, when you needed to overwhelm your enemy with sheer numbers of weapons, the Japanese approach was catastrophic. Yamamoto thought about aircraft carriers. Japan was building two new carriers, Akagi and Kaga, converted from battleship hulls. They were impressive vessels, among the largest carriers in the world. Japanese naval aviation was excellent, pilots trained for years, aircraft were well designed, tactics were sophisticated, but if war came and those carriers were sunk, how long would it take to replace them? Years, perhaps 5 years to build a new carrier, train its air wing, integrate it into the fleet. How long would it take America to replace a sunken carrier? He did not know exactly, but observing the River Rouge complex gave him a terrifying estimate. If American shipyards applied the same mass production techniques they used for automobiles, if they treated aircraft carriers as just another manufacturing problem to be solved with system optimization and high-volume production, they might be able to build carriers in a fraction of the time Japan required. It was not just about the ships themselves, it was about the entire system. American aircraft manufacturers, learning from Ford's methods, might be able to produce aircraft at rates that Japan could never match. American training facilities, built with the same systematic approach, might be able to train pilots in months rather than years. The quality of individual pilots might be lower. The quality of individual aircraft might be lower. But quantity could overwhelm quality if the disparity was large enough. This was the lesson of industrial warfare that so many military officers refused to accept. They clung to romantic notions of combat, of warrior spirit, of tactical brilliance, deciding battles. Yamamoto knew better. He had studied history. He had seen what industrial production could achieve. And, more importantly, he had seen what it meant when one side possessed overwhelming industrial superiority and the will to use it. The American Civil War had demonstrated this in the 1860s. World War I had demonstrated it again in the 19-teens. Germany had possessed superior tactics, better trained troops, and technological advantages in specific weapon systems. None of it had mattered once American industrial production entered the war. The Allied advantage in steel, in shells, in rifles, in trucks, in everything, had simply ground the German army down through attrition. Japan was positioning itself to fight a war against an opponent with 10 times its steel production, 100 times its oil production, and a population almost twice as large. Worse, that opponent's population was mechanically literate in ways Japanese population was not. American farmers owned automobiles. American workers understood electricity and pneumatic systems and combustion engines. These were not special skills in America. They were basic competencies that millions of citizens possessed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. If war came, America could mobilize those millions of mechanically literate citizens, give them abbreviated military training, and have them serving effectively in technical roles within months. Japan could not do this. Japanese society remained largely agricultural. Mechanical skills were concentrated in urban areas among industrial workers who were already employed in factories at maximum capacity. There was no reserve of mechanically skilled manpower that could be rapidly mobilized. Yamamoto's tour of the River Rouge complex lasted several hours. He took detailed notes. He made sketches. He asked technical questions about production rates, about material flows, about logistics and supply chains. The Ford representatives answered everything. They were proud of their achievement. They wanted to share their knowledge. They believed, as many Americans did, that industrial progress was fundamentally peaceful, that nations that traded together and learned from each other would not go to war. Yamamoto knew this was naive. He knew that political forces in Japan were pushing toward conflict, toward an empire that would secure resources and markets through military conquest. He knew that military leaders in Tokyo believed Japan's spiritual superiority and tactical skill would overcome any material disadvantages. They were wrong. They were dangerously, catastrophically wrong. But they would not listen to him. As evening approached and his tour concluded, Yamamoto stood one final time, looking at the Rouge complex. Shift change was beginning. Thousands of workers streamed out of the factories, heading to their homes, to their families, to their American lives of material comfort that Japanese workers could barely imagine. In a few hours, a new shift would arrive. The factories would continue running through the night. Steel would continue flowing. Automobiles would continue rolling off assembly lines. The great machine of American industry would continue operating, indifferent to the concerns of a Japanese naval officer who understood too much. He thought about what he would write in his next report to Tokyo. He would explain again that America's strength was not primarily in its military, but in its industrial capacity. He would note that the Rouge complex alone produced more steel annually than many nations. He would point out that American automobile factories could be converted to military production with minimal delay. He would emphasize that quantity of production, not quality of individual weapons, would likely determine the outcome of any future conflict. His report would be received. It would be read. It would be filed. Nothing would change. The car, taking him back to Detroit, started its engine. Yamamoto took his seat in the back. As they drove away from the complex, he looked back at the smokestacks, at the glow of blast furnaces visible even in daylight, at the railroad cars moving endlessly through the facility. He thought about his father, a samurai who had served the old Nagaoka domain before the Meiji Restoration. His father had witnessed the end of feudal Japan, the transformation from a samurai society to a modern industrial state. That transformation had been wrenching but necessary. Now, Japan faced another transformation it refused to accept. Modern warfare required modern industry. Modern industry required modern social organization. Japan was trying to maintain traditional social structures while competing with nations that had fully embraced industrial modernity. It was trying to preserve warrior culture while fighting opponents who treated war as a production problem to be solved with engineering and logistics. It could not work. It would not work. And when war came, as Yamamoto increasingly believed it would, Japan would learn this lesson at terrible cost. He spent the rest of his time in America, gathering more information. He visited steel mills in Pittsburgh. He toured shipyards on both coasts. He examined oil production facilities in Texas. Everywhere he went, he saw the same pattern. American industry operated at a scale and with an efficiency that Japan could not match. And more troubling, American industry was still growing, still innovating, still finding ways to produce more with less labor and less cost. The conversion potential was what haunted him most. In peacetime, these factories produced consumer goods. Ford made automobiles. General Motors made automobiles. Dozens of other manufacturers made appliances, tractors, machine tools, electrical equipment. But all of this production represented convertible capacity. The factories could pivot. The workers could be retrained. The supply chains could be redirected. And when that happened, when American industry fully mobilized for war, the output would be staggering. Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1928. After completing his assignment as naval attaché. He was promoted to captain and given command of the aircraft carrier Akagiki. His time in America had transformed him from a conventional naval officer into something more dangerous, to Japanese war planning, A realist who understood the enemy's true strength, he tried to share his understanding. In meetings with fellow officers, in reports to the Naval Ministry, in private conversations with anyone who would listen, he emphasized the same points. America's industrial capacity was overwhelming. American society was mechanically sophisticated. American production methods could be rapidly scaled for war. Fighting such an opponent would be catastrophic unless Japan could win quickly, before American industry fully mobilized. His warnings were not well received. Many officers viewed him with suspicion. He had spent too much time in America. He had perhaps been seduced by American culture, American comfort, American materialism. Some whispered that he had lost his fighting spirit, that his concerns about industrial production represented a failure to understand the importance of warrior discipline and tactical superiority. The dominant view in the Japanese military, particularly in the army, was that spirit could overcome material. Japan had defeated Russia in 1905 through superior morale and better tactics. The same principles would work against America. Western nations were soft, decadent, lacking the discipline and sacrifice that characterized Japanese culture. Once war began, once Americans experienced the reality of combat, their will would break. They would negotiate peace rather than endure prolonged sacrifice. Yamamoto knew this was fantasy. He had seen American determination. He had studied American history. He knew that Americans had fought a civil war that cost 600,000 lives, roughly 2% of their entire population. They had fought that war with industrial ruthlessness, destroying entire regions, burning cities, tearing up railroad tracks, until one side was completely defeated. That was not the behavior of a soft, decadent people. That was the behavior of a nation that, once committed to war, would pursue victory with systematic thoroughness. Moreover, the institutional mechanisms for mobilization existed. The United States had a selective service system. It had reserve officer training programs. It had industrial coordination protocols developed during World War I. All of this infrastructure lay dormant in peacetime. But it could be activated quickly. When war came, the machinery would start, and within months, American production capacity would begin converting from peace to war. By the early 1930s, Yamamoto had been promoted to Rear Admiral. He attended the London Naval Conference in 1934, where he fought for naval parity with Western powers. Japan was constrained by treaty to building capital ships at 60% the rate of America and Britain. This 5-5-3 ratio, established at the Washington Conference of 1921 and 1922, Yamamoto called a national degradation. He demanded equality. But even as he made these arguments publicly, he understood privately that the ratios were almost irrelevant. If war came, treaty limitations would disappear. Each side would build as many ships as its industrial capacity allowed, and in that competition, Japan would lose. American shipyards could outbuild Japanese shipyards by factors of 5 or 10 to 1 once fully mobilized. Fighting for treaty parity was fighting over peacetime numbers that would become meaningless the moment war began. By 1936, Yamamoto had been appointed Vice Minister of the Japanese Navy. He now sat at the till where strategic decisions were made, and he watched with growing alarm as Japan moved steadily toward conflict with the Western powers. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The Second Sino-Japanese War beginning in 1937. Each step expanded Japanese commitments, consumed resources, and pushed toward confrontation with America and Britain. He opposed these policies openly. He argued against the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, calling the fascist powers immoral and warning that alliance with them would guarantee war with America. He received death threats from right-wing nationalists who viewed his opposition as treason. His concerns for his own safety became so severe that Prime Minister Konoe, to protect him, appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in August 1939, effectively moving him out of Tokyo and onto a flagship where assassins could not easily reach him. As commander of the fleet, Yamamoto continued to oppose war with America. In November 1940, he warned Prime Minister Konoe directly. He said that if ordered to fight, he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, he had utterly no confidence in victory. He was not being modest. He was not engaging in strategic misdirection. He was telling the simple truth as he understood it. Japan could achieve early victories through surprise and superior training. But once American industry mobilized, once the productive capacity he had witnessed at the River Rouge complex turned to war production, Japan would be buried under an avalanche of ships, planes, and weapons. His warnings were ignored. The political situation continued deteriorating. America imposed oil embargoes, cutting off the 80% of Japan's oil supplies. Japan faced a choice: back down from its imperial ambitions, or go to war to secure the resources necessary to sustain those ambitions. The military leadership chose war, and Yamamoto, the reluctant admiral, the man who understood better than anyone that this war was unwinnable, was ordered to devise the opening attack. What he created was Pearl Harbor, a massive carrier strike designed to cripple the American Pacific Fleet in a single blow. The plan was brilliant in its audacity. 6 carriers would approach Hawaiian waters undetected. 400 aircraft would strike at dawn. Battleships would be sunk. Aircraft would be destroyed on the ground. The American Navy would be devastated before it even knew war had begun. Yamamoto understood this was not a path to victory. It was a desperate gamble. If the attack succeeded, if it shocked America into negotiating peace rather than fighting a prolonged war, then perhaps Japan could secure its conquests. But if America responded with determination, if it mobilized its full industrial capacity for war, then Japan was doomed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not a confidence play. It was an act of desperation by a nation that had backed itself into a corner and could see no other way out. The attack occurred on December 7th, 1941. In tactical terms, it was a stunning success. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, more than 2,000 US. Americans were killed. Japanese losses were minimal. News of the victory electrified Japan. The attack seemed to vindicate those who had argued for war, who had insisted that Japanese fighting spirit and superior training could overcome any material disadvantages. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. He famously wrote that he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. Whether he actually wrote those exact words remains debated by historians. But the sentiment was entirely consistent with everything he had said and written for the previous 15 years. He understood what his superiors did not. Pearl Harbor had not won the war. It had merely ensured that the war would be fought to the finish, with no possibility of negotiated peace. And that meant everything he had feared would come to pass. The American response proved him right. Congress declared war with near unanimity. The isolationist movement collapsed overnight. Across America, millions of men volunteered for military service. The factories that Yamamoto had toured in the 1920s began converting to military production. The River Rouge complex stopped producing civilian automobiles and began producing military trucks and jeeps. Aircraft factories that had built a few hundred planes per year began tooling up for production of thousands per month. Shipyards that had launched 1 or 2 vessels per year began preparing to launch dozens. The transformation happened faster than even Yamamoto had anticipated. American industry did not gradually ramp up production. It exploded into military manufacturing with shocking speed. The systems were already in place. The workers were already trained. The supply chains were already established. All that was needed was the political will to activate them. Pearl Harbor had provided that will in abundance. By mid-1942, American production numbers were beginning to reflect the mobilization. Steel output was increasing, aluminum production was soaring, aircraft factories were doubling and tripling their capacity. New shipyards were being built on both coasts. The Willow Run plant, built by Ford near Detroit, began producing B-24 Liberator bombers. At peak production, Willow Run produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes. This was the nightmare scenario. This was the industrial juggernaut Yamamoto had warned about. Liberty ships, the cargo vessels necessary to transport materials and supplies across the Pacific, were being built in weeks rather than months. Henry Kaiser, applying Ford's mass production techniques to shipbuilding, revolutionized the industry. Shipyards on the West Coast were launching vessels at rates that seemed impossible. The Robert E. Peary, a Liberty ship built in Kaiser's yard, was completed in 4 days and 15.5 hours from keel laying to launch. This was not a record that would stand long. It was merely a demonstration of what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized. Japan had no answer to this. Japanese shipyards continued building vessels using traditional methods. Construction times remained measured in years. A Japanese aircraft carrier took 3 to 5 years from keel laying to commissioning. American shipyards were preparing to build escort carriers in months. The arithmetic was brutal. Japan would need to achieve kill ratios of 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 just to stay even with American production. Such ratios were impossible to sustain. The battles of 1942 demonstrated the problem. The Battle of Midway in June was Japan's first major defeat. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Hundreds of experienced pilots were killed. Yamamoto had led the operation personally, hoping to draw out and destroy the American carriers. Instead, American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes. They knew where the attack was coming. They were waiting. The loss of 4 carriers in a single day was catastrophic. But even more catastrophic was what it represented. Japan could not replace those carriers. The shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity. There were no reserve construction facilities. The pilots who had been killed represented years of training investment. They could not be quickly replaced. The Battle of Midway had not just cost Japan 4 carriers. It had cost Japan the initiative, the tactical superiority, and the strategic momentum that were its only hope of victory. America, by contrast, was just beginning to mobilize. The carriers sunk at Midway were already being replaced by new construction. The Essex-class carriers, larger and more capable than anything Japan had built, were moving through American shipyards. By war's end, America would have commissioned more than 20 Essex-class carriers, plus dozens of smaller escort carriers. Japan would struggle to replace the 4 it lost at Midway. The industrial disparity that Yamamoto had warned about was now manifesting in combat results. Japanese forces continued fighting with skill and courage. Individual Japanese pilots and soldiers remained formidable opponents, but they were facing an enemy that could absorb losses and come back stronger, that could replace every destroyed aircraft with 2 new aircraft, that could replace every sunken ship with 3 new ships. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942, demonstrated the grinding nature of industrial warfare. For 6 months, Japanese and American forces fought for control of a single island. Japan committed substantial resources, including multiple naval task forces, thousands of troops, and hundreds of aircraft. They fought with desperate courage. They suffered terrible losses, and in the end, they were forced to evacuate. It was not that Japanese forces fought poorly. It was that American forces could sustain losses that would have been crippling for Japan. An American destroyer sunk in a night engagement was replaced within months. A Japanese destroyer sunk in the same engagement might never be replaced. American aircraft shot down were replaced within weeks by new production. Japanese aircraft lost could not be replaced fast enough to maintain squadron strength. Yamamoto committed the combined fleet to defending Guadalcanal because he understood the strategic importance of the battle. If Japan could not hold Guadalcanal, if it could not maintain control of the Solomon Islands, then the entire defensive perimeter was compromised. But committing resources to Guadalcanal meant burning through irreplaceable naval assets. Every battle, win or lose, consumed ships and aircraft that Japan could not afford to lose. By early 1943, the strategic situation was becoming hopeless. American production was reaching staggering levels. Aircraft production exceeded 100,000 planes per year. Shipyards were launching one new vessel every day on average. The industrial capacity that Yamamoto had observed at the River Rouge complex in 1925 was now fully mobilized and directed toward war. The flood had been released. Japan, meanwhile, was running out of everything. Fuel oil was critically short. The merchant fleet necessary to transport raw materials from conquered territories to Japanese factories was being decimated by American submarines. Steel production was constrained by lack of raw materials. Aircraft production remained limited by factory capacity. Everything Japan needed to sustain the war required resources it did not control and supply lines it could not protect. Yamamoto never lived to see the final collapse. On April 18, 1943, he was killed when American fighters shot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville. American cryptographers had intercepted messages detailing his inspection tour. Admiral Nimitz authorized the operation specifically to eliminate Yamamoto, understanding that his strategic genius and leadership made him uniquely valuable to Japan. His death was a blow to Japanese morale, but by that point, the war's outcome was already determined. The industrial forces Yamamoto had warned about were in motion. Nothing could stop them. The question was not whether Japan would lose, but how long the war would continue and how many lives would be consumed before the inevitable conclusion. The numbers tell the story with mathematical certainty. In 1944, the United States produced more than 96,000 aircraft. Japan produced 28,000. America produced 63,000 tanks. Japan produced 2,100. America produced 88 million tons of steel. Japan produced 7.5 million tons. These were not small differences. These were overwhelming disparities that no amount of tactical skill or fighting spirit could overcome. American shipyards produced 141 aircraft carriers of all types between 1941 and 1945. This number included fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan commissioned 15 carriers during the same period. American yards built more than 2,000 escort vessels. Japan built a few dozen. The scale of production was so vastly different that comparison became almost meaningless, and this production went to equipment that American industry was constantly improving. American aircraft in 1945 were dramatically superior to those in 1941. The Hellcat and Corsair fighters that appeared in 1943 outclassed the Japanese Zero fighters that had dominated the early war. American radar, fire control systems, and damage control procedures all improved continuously throughout the war. Japan, constrained by production limitations, could not afford to frequently update designs or implement improvements across its existing forces. The bombing of Japan itself, beginning in earnest in 1944, brought home the industrial reality. B-29 Superfortress bombers, each costing $750,000 and representing the most advanced aircraft in the world, struck Japanese cities with impunity. Japan had no effective defense. The fighters that could reach B-29 altitude were too slow and too few. The industrial capacity necessary to produce adequate numbers of effective interceptors simply did not exist. By 1945, the situation was desperate. Japanese cities were being systematically destroyed by incendiary bombing. The naval blockade was nearly complete. Industrial production had collapsed. Food was scarce. The military was preparing for a final defense of the home islands, planning to use remaining forces and mobilized civilians in suicidal attacks against the anticipated American invasion. That invasion, Operation Downfall, was planned for November 1945. American planners estimated it would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties. The entire nation would become a battlefield. Every city, every town, every field would be fought over. The war would continue into 1946 or beyond, consuming lives on a scale that exceeded even the terrible losses already suffered. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 changed this calculus. On August 6th, a single B-29 dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima, destroying the city and killing more than 70,000 people instantly. On August 9th, a plutonium bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The Japanese government, facing annihilation, agreed to surrender. The irony was profound. The bombs themselves were products of the same industrial capacity Yamamoto had feared. The Manhattan Project, the program that developed atomic weapons, cost $2 billion and employed more than 130,000 people at its peak. It required industrial facilities on a massive scale, including entire factories built solely to enrich uranium or produce plutonium. Only a nation with America's industrial capacity could have undertaken such a project while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts. In retrospect, everything Yamamoto had feared came to pass. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened the sleeping giant. American industry had mobilized completely. The productive capacity he had observed at the Rouge complex had been multiplied across thousands of factories, millions of workers, and applied with systematic thoroughness to the prosecution of total war. Japan, despite the courage of its military forces and the skill of its commanders, had been overwhelmed by sheer material superiority. The lesson was not complicated. Modern warfare between industrial nations is decided primarily by industrial capacity. Training matters, tactics matter, technology matters. But all of these factors are secondary to the fundamental question of who can produce more weapons, more ships, more aircraft, more ammunition, more fuel, more everything. In a war of attrition between industrial powers, the side with larger industrial capacity will eventually prevail unless it loses the political will to continue fighting. Japan had gambled that America would lose that political will. Yamamoto had warned this was a dangerous assumption. He had seen American determination. He had studied American history. He understood that Americans, once committed to war, would prosecute it with the same industrial thoroughness they applied to manufacturing automobiles. He was right. The tragedy is that so many people had to die learning this lesson. Yamamoto had tried to prevent the war. He had argued against the policies that led to conflict. He had warned repeatedly about American industrial capacity. His warnings were dismissed. The war happened anyway, and the result was exactly what he had predicted. Japan was destroyed. Millions died. Cities were reduced to rubble. The empire was lost. All of it could have been avoided if political leaders had listened to the admiral who understood the enemy's true strength. Standing in the ruins of post-war Japan, survivors must have remembered Yamamoto's warnings. They must have reflected on what he had said about American factories, about production capacity, about the impossibility of winning a prolonged war against such an opponent. He had been right. He had been right about everything. His tragedy was that he understood too much, too clearly, and could not prevent the disaster he foresaw. The Rouge complex continued operating after the war. It converted back to civilian production, manufacturing automobiles instead of military vehicles. The smokestacks still poured smoke into the Michigan sky. The blast furnaces still glowed. The assembly lines still moved. The great industrial machine that had helped defeat Japan returned to its peacetime work as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The world had learned that industrial capacity was military power. Nations that wished to remain secure needed not just strong armies, but strong factories. The lesson of World War II was fundamentally about production, about logistics, about the ability to transform raw materials into finished weapons at rates that could overwhelm any opponent. Yamamoto had understood this in 1925 when he stood at the edge of the Rouge complex and watched iron ore transform into automobiles. He had spent the next 16 years trying to prevent a war he knew Japan could not win. When war came anyway, he fought as his duty required, planning operations with brilliant tactical skill. But tactical skill meant nothing against the industrial avalanche he had predicted. His legacy is complex. In Japan, he is remembered as a brilliant admiral who achieved stunning victories in the early war. In America, he is remembered as the architect of Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack that brought America into World War II. But perhaps his most important legacy is as a strategic prophet who understood industrial warfare and tried desperately to prevent his nation from pursuing a conflict it could not win. The lesson remains relevant. In modern warfare, as in past conflicts, industrial capacity and production capability remain fundamental. The ability to produce weapons, to sustain military forces, to replace combat losses, these factors determine outcomes more surely than tactical brilliance or technological advantages. Nations that ignore this lesson, that assume fighting spirit or tactical superiority, can overcome industrial disparities, risk repeating Japan's mistake. Yamamoto would have understood the irony. The visit to the River Rouge complex that opened his eyes to American industrial capacity was part of a goodwill diplomatic mission. American hosts had proudly shown him their achievements, never imagining they were revealing the source of their future victory to a future enemy. They believed that industrial progress promoted peace, that nations that understood each other's capabilities would avoid war. They were half right. Understanding did not prevent war, but it did allow one man, standing at the edge of a factory complex in Michigan, watching iron ore transform into automobiles, to see the future with terrible clarity. He saw that if war came between Japan and America, the nation with the River Rouge complex and thousands of factories like it would prevail. He saw that industrial capacity would decide the outcome regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. He saw that Japan was positioning itself for catastrophic defeat. He tried to warn them. They would not listen. And so the war came. And the predictions proved accurate, and millions died learning lessons that one admiral had understood 20 years before in a factory in Michigan. That is the tragedy. That is the warning. That is the story of how a tour of Ford's River Rouge complex revealed the outcome of World War II to the one man who understood what he was seeing and could not prevent what he knew was coming. The smokestacks of the Rouge still stand today. The factory still operates, though much reduced from its wartime peak. Tourists can visit and see where automobiles are made. They walk through the same buildings where Admiral Yamamoto stood in 1925. Most do not know that a Japanese naval officer once toured this facility and understood with terrible clarity that what he was seeing represented a form of power that his nation could never match. Most do not know that the industrial capacity he observed would, 16 years later, be turned to war production and would help bury Japan under an avalanche of ships, planes, and weapons. But the history is there. The lesson is there. Industrial capacity is military power. Production capability determines outcomes. Nations that understand this plan accordingly, nations that ignore this, repeat the mistakes of the past. Admiral Yamamoto understood. He warned. He was ignored. And the result was exactly what he predicted. That is the legacy of the River Rouge complex and the admiral who saw too much. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.